So welcome everyone, welcome to the Norwich Bookstore. We are here to celebrate Save Me a Seat. And I'm Beth, I'm a bookseller here at the store, and I was very excited to give you this introduction this evening. So years ago, my family and I would celebrate special holidays each year. There were the ones you might guess, sort of like Halloween, Thanksgiving, but chief among them was the day when the Dartmouth Film Society released their next set of films and their schedule. Many of those posters are now hanging in our hallway at home because the artwork was just so stunning. But once they released that schedule, it was just such a thrill to see, like, what's the theme going to be? What are the movies that they're grouping? And then we would all get out the calendar and then we would like mark down the dates that we were going to go to the theater. And this is, of course, Spalding Theater. And just walking in there was just magical. You know, you never knew what you were going to be in for that evening. And I just have these very vivid memories of letting the kids choose one time, and we had to sit at the very front to watch Singing in the Rain. I've never done that before, never since. And then there was the evening where, for a school assignment, we had to go watch My Friend Flicka. And I had assumed that I had read the book before, and I did not. So I was totally blindsided by that ending, drove home, you know, sobbing. That kind of did me in. But I also have wonderful memories of driving up from here to the Savoy, especially one evening to watch Captain Fantastic, and just driving home and these scenes just replaying in my head as I'm coming home. And you know, the movies, sometimes they don't leave you, they stay with you for a while. But my favorite part of the evening was picking out the snacks, because the snacks at the Savoy are legendary. And I asked Rick what his favorite was, and he said popcorn with brewer's yeast. And I personally, I love a good milk dud mixed in with my popcorn. You know, so. But this evening we are here to celebrate the release of Save Me a Seat, Rick Winston's Life and Movies. And after the presentation, Rick will be joined by Steve Bissette in conversation. So a little bit about them. Rick Winston grew up in Yonkers, New York, and became hooked watching old films on TV at a young age. Went to Columbia College and University of California, Berkeley. I heard you all talking about that earlier, where there are many opportunities to catch up on films while putting off writing English literature papers. He moved to Vermont in 1970 and shortly after founded the Lightning Ridge Film Society, which morphed into the Savoy Theater in 1981. He was one of the founders of Montpelier's Green Mountain Film Festival and was its program director until 2012. He is the author of Red Scare in the Green Mountains, Vermont and the McCarthy Era, 1946 to 60, put out in 2018. And Stephen Bissette is a pioneer graduate of the Joe Kubert School, was an instructor at the Center for Cartoon Studies from 2005 to 2020. He is renowned for his work on The Swamp Thing, Taboo, and 1963. He is a comics creator, an illustrator, and author. And his latest includes Cryptid Cinema, A Boggy Creek Primer, and the Midnight Movie Monograph, David Cronenberg's The Brood, sketchbooks Thoughtful Creatures and Brooding Creatures, and of course co-authoring Studio of Screams. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, because one of the things I think that the pandemic really disrupted was the evenings where we spend sort of in communal settings, you know, like movies, concerts, presentations, and I find that when we are all together like this, something special happens. And so I hope that the chance to sit and chat about the theater experience leaves you inspired and maybe just a little changed. So please join me in welcoming Rick Winston.
Thank you.
And about his film this evening.
I think the Norwich Bookstore probably has some books by novels by my friend Howard Norman.
Yes.
Yes. Howard told a great story when he was a struggling writer, that he had his first public reading, and it was very disappointing. He came home and his grandfather said to him, "Well, how did it go?" And Howard said, "Well, only 5 people came." His grandfather said, "Did you owe any of the money?" Howard said no, and his grandfather says, 5 is good. So that's been my motto ever since then. Thank you for the invitation to the Norwich Bookstore. I have to admit this is my first time setting foot inside, and I looked longingly from the outside for many years. And I am going to not exactly read, but talk about a chapter. This is going to be like one of those movies that starts in the present and then flashes back. And it turns out that there's a framing device. Anyway, I'm a big fan of memoirs and biographies. And I always find, well, usually, the last time I was reading the memoir by Keith Richards, and I found myself, it was so much more interesting to find out how he got to be who he is than the whole second half of the book, what he did once he got there. You know, that the Rolling Stones, they just wanted to be the best blues band in London. That's all they wanted. Anyway, so opening night at the Savoy, it was January 10th, 1981. We had shown Casablanca the night before, and this was the Times Argus from the next day. So I'm going to be talking about what the 10 years that led up to that moment. And need a little background information that's in the chapter before. And that starts with a high school photo, not mine, but Stanley Kubrick's. Stanley Kubrick was a student at the high school where my father taught in the Bronx, Taft High School. And though my father did not have Kubrick in any of his classes, every teacher knew this kid. What is going to become of Stanley Kubrick? He is so brilliant, but he insists on cutting school and going down to Times Square to take photos. Can't buckle down to anything. Well, anyway, I took a friend of mine back in Yonkers, New York, on a trip down back from Vermont. I took her to see 2001. It was my fourth time. I think it was her first. And I had told her about my father's connection with Kubrick. And she was very impressed with the movie. And later that year, she got me a present. And it was a book called Stanley Kubrick Directs. My parents had, I think this is the first time I heard about Kubrick was, Beth was talking about special occasions. On Christmas Day, we always went to the movies. And my father said, okay, this movie Paths of Glory is playing in the Bronx somewhere. I was 10 years old. It was a pretty heavy movie for a 10-year-old, but boy, was I ever impressed. So I had told Joanne, my friend, this story, so she got me this book. So there I was. I had moved to Vermont like a year and a half earlier, and I was looking through this book, and I said, The Killing. Would I love to see The Killing again? Lolita. Of course, Dr. Strangelove. And 2001. I said, I'd just love to see these movies again, but where am I going to see them around here? It's just not going to happen. But all of a sudden, I was seized by this idea. I said, well, maybe the only way they're going to happen is if I have something to do with it. And for me, this was a very radical idea because I went through 4 years of college at two colleges who both had fantastic film societies and great repertory theaters just 10 minutes away. I was perfectly happy to have my film experience curated by others. Never occurred to me for a minute that people get together in a room and they figure out what is going to be shown. I could be one of those people. Never occurred to me. But living in Vermont, where you didn't have the chance to go to the movies every night of the week, I said, well, maybe this is time for me to do something. So this is part of the do-it-yourself ethos of Vermont, central Vermont in particular, in the early 70s. One of the first people I met felt the way about choral music that I did about movies. He was used to singing every night of the week in Boston. Well, he started a chorus. That's Larry Gordon, who died just 2 years ago, who brought sacred harp music and all kinds of wonderful choral music to central Vermont. So anyway, I was seized with this idea of maybe I could start a film society like the ones where I saw in college. And before I could talk myself out of it, I got in the car and went 20 minutes down the road to Montpelier, and a brand new, relatively new organization, the Vermont Council on the Arts, had formed. And maybe it was a slow day, but I went right into the office of the project director, Ellen McCulloch-Lovell. Ellen has since, she worked at the council for many years. She went to Washington to be the aide to Senator Leahy. She came back to be the president of Marlborough College for 15 years. Now she's back in Montpelier. But she was the guardian angel for the Film Society idea. She didn't know me, she just listened to my idea, and she said, okay, well, let's see, we're gonna need a place, and that place is probably the Pavilion Auditorium. It's the state auditorium in the basement of the Pavilion office building. Sloped floor, 200 fixed seats, a white wall. They actually, when the structure was built, they actually planned for a projection room, but didn't have the money to finish it. So if you stand in the back of the pavilion and look up, you can see those projectionist windows with nothing behind it, just an empty room. You know, Ellen suggested the pavilion. She said, well, you'll need a state sponsor to use the pavilion. That'll be us, we'll do that. And I was thinking, Montpelier, gee, Montpelier, I just kind of assumed that this was maybe going to happen in Plainfield, where Goddard was, and the kind of the center of the culture in those days. But I said, okay, sure, let's do the Pavilion Auditorium. So I had, the one who got me to Vermont in the first place, which is a longer story, is Walter Unger. And he was the one-man film department at Goddard. And he said, okay, well, this is how it works. You'll need film catalogs, like the ones that Steve brought in to show me. And this is how you do it. If you figure out what you're going to show, you'll pay them, you'll order it on the phone, or through this thing you fill out. That'll come in this box, and then you put it together. So, and Ellen also had a suggestion where to get projectors, 2 projectors. Why 2? Because they came, you know, like 30, 40 minutes to a 16mm reel, and you didn't want to have to wait until the projectionist threaded up the other one. So found out where to get those 2 projectors. And I recalled that I actually had been in the Pavilion Auditorium just once to see the movie Way Down East. And the reason I went to see this was because somebody said, there's this woman from Morrisville who plays piano for the silent movies. You've got to hear her play. Hazel Carlson was her name. And so I showed up in Montpelier to the Pavilion to see Way Down East, and she was terrific. I say in the book, it sounded like there were 8 hands on this piano. What I didn't know, so Way Down East, directed by D.W. Griffith. Lillian Gish plays a woman who has been what they call done wrong. She has an illegitimate child. She moves to this little town supposedly in Vermont. Well, they did film a lot of it in White River Junction. And then her secret comes out, and her true love, and there's a chase across the ice. Well, given the plot of this movie, it's not surprising that this showing was a benefit for Planned Parenthood. So, and it was my introduction to what I come to think of as the Montpelier intelligentsia, the people who dressed a lot better than I did. Once what I got used to going to events in Plainfield. I got to know many of these people over the years who became steadfast supporters of first the Film Society and then the theater. So I had a real insight into the dynamics of the time. Every Friday I had to go to the Pavilion Auditorium where the Vermont Historical Society was and get the key to open up the auditorium doors. And the woman who was the key keeper, a wonderful woman named Jean Kate, she was married to the director of the Vermont Historical Society, Winston Kate Jr. And Jean and I developed a friendship over many Fridays. And so flash forward to 1995 or so. The Savoy has been in Montpelier for 15 years by that point. And I see Jean coming on the street, coming the other way. She says, "Rick, I have a confession to make to you." And I think to myself, what possibly could Jean Kate be confessing to me? She said, "Well, remember all those years ago you used to get the key for me every Friday?" I said, "Of course I do." She said, "I came this close to saying to you, what are you wasting your energy for? This town is so dead. This town will never appreciate what you're trying to do." I said, "I almost said it." I said, "But you were so young and so idealistic. I just didn't want to burst your balloon." So we had a very good laugh over that, and we're glad that she was so wrong. So the Montpelier that Jean described was changing very rapidly in the early 1970s. The late Yvonne Daly wrote in her book, Going Up the Country, "The newcomers and the locals who joined them transformed the once solidly conservative state into one of the nation's most progressive." So one Goddard graduate, Ginny Callan, started the Horn of the Moon natural food store in Langdon Street. Fred Wilbur, another Goddard graduate, the alternative music store, started as a head shop. And then visionary educators created the Community College of Vermont, which is still going. The Plainfield Co-op became an institution. So political changes were also reconfiguring Vermont. In 1974, Patrick Leahy became the first Democrat to be ever elected to the U.S. Senate. Dean Davis was governor when I moved up, and even though he was a solid Republican businessman, he was the one who passed Act 250. And I got to know, in the last few years, somebody who had been an aide to Davis, who grew up as a family friend and became Davis's driver during the campaign of 1968. And they had a Republican fundraiser somewhere near Wilmington, Mount Snow. And out on the mountainside, and Davis looked across the mountain to all this clear cutting that was going on, these houses that were going up. And Davis turned to my friend Chuck and he said, "That has got to stop." So Chuck said, "I was there when Act 250 was the light bulb that went on in Dean Davis's head." Our Senator George Aiken was an outspoken opponent of the Vietnam War. His famous saying is, "Just say we won and get out." And then a political outlier, recent arrival, Bernie Sanders, made his first run for governor in 1974. So the time was readier than I thought to start this film society. I wasn't, it's only in retrospect that we can appreciate these cultural changes. So there's our first program. I brought a few tonight to hand out. I know this is way too small. So the name came from the road that I live on, they lived on and still live on. The only thing that's changed is, you see it says Lightning Ridge. When 911 came in, there was a big fight in town. Was it lightning or lightening? And there was a faction that said the name came from the fact that the trucks going to the granite quarries had to lighten their load when they went down the hill. And that faction won out, so it is now Lightning Ridge Road, but it's still Lightning Ridge Film Society to me. Calligraphy by my father, Leon Winston. And I got the catalogs from Walter, figured out how much money I could afford to lose. These films were, I think, the most expensive one is probably $40. In this, they call it in the industry non-theatrical renting. You know, the companies had movies that went to the theaters, but then a separate branch to do 16 millimeters for hospitals, schools, et cetera, et cetera. So the question was, would there be an audience? And right from the get-go, Steve was there that very first night. Dead of Night, which was these were some of the movies that were on that list. Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, $1 Million Legs with W.C. Fields, which I saw for the first time when I was like 8 years old and have loved ever since. East of Eden, which I saw for the first time in college and have loved ever since. So Our Man in Havana, The Wrong Box were also on there, and one of my favorite films ever, Fritz Lang's Testament of Dr. Mabuse. And for those who couldn't wait to see the new Stanley Kubrick film, Barry Lyndon, there was The Killing. Mickey One with Warren Beatty, which really showed how Hollywood directors like Arthur Penn were influenced by heavy-thinking European filmmakers. And one of the few color films we showed, One-Eyed Jacks with Marlon Brando. So the opening film was Dead of Night, a British supernatural thriller that I first saw in UC Berkeley and could not wait to spring on an unsuspecting audience. It is a very twisted movie. There are 5 supernatural little stories that are tied together with a framing, really creepy story. Anyway, the only downside that opening night was our very well-meaning custodian. I didn't even think about cluing him in, but the final twist in the movie is played out against the final credits. He saw the movie was ending and turned up all the lights. But so Lightning Ridge Film Society went on for 8 years, and it also provided me a chance to broaden my own education. And one example I give in this chapter is thanks to a random late night movie watching, I got turned on to Preston Sturges and the movie with Joel McRae and Veronica Lake, Sullivan's Travels. I wanted to see all of Sturgis's movies. I programmed one each time. But then I found out that he was a writer, screenwriter, before he was a director. So I started seeking out those films, especially one called Remember the Night with Barbara Stanwyck and Fred MacMurray. Then I started noticing who directed that movie. It was a man named Mitchell Leeson, who was a studio director, but was given some of the bigger budget movies. And started programming some Leeson films. There he is. Midnight with Don Amici, Claudia Colbert, and John Barrymore. And Easy Living. Now, Sturges wrote the script for Easy Living, but Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett wrote the script for Midnight. I didn't know Billy Wilder was a writer before he became a director. So I started checking out Billy Wilder written movies, including Ninotchka, which led me to the great German emigre director Ernst Lubitsch. And my curiosity about Wilder led me into the murky waters of film noir. And I discovered that this genre that got named retrospectively, it was a very American genre with a French name, where most of the directors were German emigres. Wilder, Preminger, Fritz Lang, Robert Siodmak. Wilder's Double Indemnity, Edward G. Robinson and Lang's Scarlet Street, Otto Preminger's Laura, and Siodmak's The Killers. Burt Lancaster's very first movie, and I just saw a reference to it as the Citizen Kane of film noir in its influence. Anyway, this is the projector we used. We started getting quite a regular audience, and I talk about some of the people who came who shared their stories with me. My friend Kathy Gibbs said the movies were on Friday night. It was the one night of the week you knew you were going to see all your friends. And my friend Ellen said, for those of us who lived in drafty Vermont farmhouses, it was the one place you knew you could get warm during the winter. And I started noticing that these two high school kids were coming every single week, not with their parents. And that would have been my friend Steve Bissette and his friend Will. And when I interviewed Steve for the book, he said, there weren't many films we missed. There was a remarkable access going back to the silent era. We really counted on you. It was as if I ordered helpings of film history on some sort of menu. Thanks for that quote. Steve told me he and his friends were sampling other film societies, whether in Waitsfield or UVM, but he said Lightning Ridge had the best sound. And that's because our Kodak pageant projectors had a intensity control where you could really sharpen the sound. It made all the difference. So two other teenagers I got to know during those years. Anne Labriciano remembered that her parents never checked to see how appropriate the film was. So as an 11-year-old, she got to see The Exterminating Angel by Louis Buñuel, one of the most disturbing movies ever made, could be, in which people go to a dinner party, the elite in Mexico City, and find at the end of the evening that they are seized with a mysterious inability to leave the room. And this goes on for a day, a week, a month, and it kind of turns into an upper-class Lord of the Flies. I just read that the posthumously produced Stephen Sondheim musical project he had been working on the last few years of his life is a musical version of The Exterminating Angel. I should amend that. The first act is Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, another Buñuel film, and the second act is Exterminating Angel. Anne said, I don't know what I was seeing, but I've never forgotten it. So a decade later, Anne became our first video store clerk at Downstairs Video, and she stayed at the Savoy for 20 years, not only at the video counter, but operating the projectors, scooping popcorn, and organizing a children's film series, because she was having children of her own. Tom Blatchley was another teenager who accompanied his parents to many screenings. This was a very formative experience for me as a teen living in Vermont. Back then, there were no opportunities to see classic films, so watching them was a complete revelation to me. And it was a particular satisfaction that years later, Tom and I collaborated for 5 years on a film series in Marshfield, Vermont. So the Lightning Ridge Film Society lasted 8 years. By my rough estimate, we showed about 250 films. This is a, let's see, sharpen.
No, it's sharp.
Yeah.
My eyes are old.
We hosted not only 2 seasons of Friday night films, but an ancillary series of contemporary foreign films. We got these as soon as they were in 16 millimeter. Fellini's The Clowns was one, and Buñuel's Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. And the success of Lightning Ridge was such that by 1978 I added an extra show on Friday nights. And it's hard to believe now that this second show is at 9 o'clock. You know, now it's like 10 o'clock is a late night for me just to get into bed. But this is where things stood in the spring of 1980 when I got the chance to take the leap from a once-a-week film society to a 7 nights a week cinema. And that's the name of the next chapter, What's Happening on Main Street. And that is the chapter about the flashback is over. Now we're at 1980 and the Savoy has begun. So, Steve, you want to pull up a chair?
Shall we?
I'm going to turn this off. You know, as I said in this chapter, I met Steve when he was a teenager, and we reconnected about 25 years after that, and we're still talking movies.
Yep, among other things.
So we didn't have anything planned tonight. We'll just chat and please ask some questions.
It was amazing what you set up in Montpelier, Rick. You had a partner when you started with...
A partner at the theater, but not at the film society.
Oh, not at the film? Oh, okay.
My girlfriend at the time helped me take tickets and stuff, but...
I mean, it was amazing. And I don't know how many of you noticed, some of you may remember the old 16 millimeter projectors. I mean, the speaker was the case for the projector. When you opened the projector, that was the speaker, the cover for the projector.
Yeah, with a little wire that went and you put it on the
middle of the room
table.
someplace.
Yeah, put it in the middle of the room.
But somehow you did have the best sound. And I did used to frequent, I mean, that was an amazing time, early 70s. You know, Burlington had 2 underground film societies, one at UVM and one that Robin Lloyd and her partner ran on Church Street upstairs over one of the buildings. There was a film society at the Odd Fellows Hall in Waitsfield. And Lightning Ridge and Goddard occasionally. And I didn't know Walter at that time, but you know, we could go, and Stan Brakhage showed up and showed his films and read Ezra Pound poetry between his films. And you know, I was 17, what did I know? But it was an amazing time. What was the largest audience you remember having the first couple of years? Like what film really brought people in?
I don't think I can answer that one.
You didn't keep head counts?
Well, I did it at the time. I do remember having to turn people away for some of the films.
Some of the films, yeah.
It might have been the real popular titles like Casablanca or Sunset Boulevard.
I mean, you also showed a lot of idiosyncratic films, too. I do remember movies. I never remember a walkout. Maybe it was just people were too polite to walk out of a film that they weren't enjoying, but I do remember some pretty eclectic films that you showed. And those were usually my favorites, just the bent of my nature.
Well, it is a real incredible phenomenon when you know that people show up no matter what is scheduled, just like Beth was talking about the Dartmouth Film Society. It says, oh, you know, 80 people are going to come see Dead of Night? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's go then.
Yeah. And it was a pretty full house that night for Dead of Night, and that was at a time when horror movies were frowned on altogether. So.
And this is 15 years before the saying, if you build it, they will come.
True enough. True enough. I also remember you would show, like I remember seeing the Molly Maguires. I mean, you showed a lot of films. That was a Martin Ritt film about a coal miner rebellion. Starred Sean Connery and Richard Harris, as I recall.
Harris, yeah.
But those were films we hadn't really heard of. They weren't written up in books. So your selection process was what I was curious about. Like, what was your selection process, especially when you brought in something like that?
I'm curious, do you have any sense of how many people actually showed up at your screenings not knowing anything about the movies they were about to see?
No, just anecdotally. Although it would be a pretty safe bet that hardly anybody would have heard of a movie like Dead of Night. Or Mickey 1, maybe.
I mean, at that time, with no internet, and there were, you know, the only film books you'd find in a local library would be like Richard Griffith's Story of the Movies or something. So it was really the program notes that brought people in. You know, we'd get the film schedule and go, well, that sounds interesting. So.
Well, I must say a lot of it was to satisfy my own curiosity. I finally had a chance to catch up on some of these titles I had heard about, I had read about. I knew they were supposed to be really good films. You know,
Did that ever backfire on you, Rick?
Well, I tell a funny story in the book that. So I'm working my way through the Preston Sturgis, and has anybody ever seen Unfaithfully Yours with Rex Harrison?
Yep.
Okay. So the movies would come in like a week early. I had the 60 millimeter projector at home. I would generally just show it to make sure it was an okay print. I was really looking forward to this movie. I had heard of it, but I had never seen it. So Rex Harrison stars as a orchestra conductor, playing a very jealous husband. Linda Darnell is his wife. He suspects she's having an affair, and this comes to light the day of a performance. And so the movie is framed around the rehearsal. They're playing 3 pieces, Rossini, Schubert, and I don't know. But in each piece, the orchestra starts to play, the camera goes in, and it goes into his eyeball, and we see his fantasy of what he is going to do that night. And in the first fantasy, he has this elaborate plot to kill her. And in the second one, he has self-sacrificing, oh, go away with him and I'll kill myself, you know. I forget what the third one was. And then finally, the performance that night, and he goes back home and he said, okay, I'm going to try to do my fantasy number 1. I won't tell you any more. I watched this at home by myself. It was a great object lesson. I said, this movie is really not funny. This movie is in really terrible taste. I better get ready for people Friday night to be really mad at me. And they loved it. They were laughing, laughing, laughing. And then I realized you can't see a comedy by yourself and judge it, and judge it accurately. And I was watching this movie again with new eyes saying, this is pretty funny.
Yeah, and the Sturgis played well. I remember the Palm Beach story when you showed it, and the audience loved it. You know? So
anyway, so the programming was partly films I remembered very fondly from childhood that I knew were, you know, the classics, Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant, etc. Then there were more recent films that had gotten good reviews and were finally available in '16. So it was a real mix, and of course it was the programmer's dilemma always: balance, comedy, drama, musical, foreign, American, old, new. You know, so.
And you did a great job with that. You mentioned Hazel Carlson. And did you bring her in to play for
No, I
silent
didn't.
films?
I regret that.
You introduced me to her at some point, and I cannot remember how that would have happened because we brought her to Johnson State College. I was booking films at Johnson State College for the 2 years I was there, and we brought Hazel in to play for the General, the Buster Keaton, the General. And she was amazing. She had played the piano for the Morrisville Bijou Theater in the silent era.
Yeah.
And
so
she was just
Yeah.
incredible with silent films. So, but you did show a number of silent films, I recall.
Oh, we did, yeah. I remember definitely Harold Lloyd's, both Safety Last and The Freshman.
Yep.
And I've always been a Keaton fan, so.
Yep. You showed some Keaton.
Definitely some
I saw my
Keaton.
first Lon Chaney film. You showed The Hunchback.
You know, I think I only showed the Charles Lawton Hunchback. Oh,
Maybe so.
oh,
No, you showed
Fact
the
check.
spectacular silent version, your own words, Rick,
oh, no,
starring Lon
no
Chaney.
wonder I didn't remember Charles Lawton. Yeah.
When you were showing the silent films, most of the 16mm films would have their own soundtrack.
Yeah,
Did you
probably.
ever change that? No?
No, I didn't. That didn't even occur to me.
I also seem to remember we didn't always get to be in the Pavilion Theater. I also remember you showing it across the street. Was it a hotel? What
Yeah,
was it?
This was a really funny thing. You know, my friend Ardino, where I live, he said, "Now, I just read your book. Did I hallucinate that other location for the Film Society? Because I didn't write about it. You remember the energy crisis of 1974?
Oh, yeah.
The energy crisis? Well, the word came down from the state of Vermont, no more use of state buildings after hours.
Oh, really?
So we had to scramble to find another place. And then it was called the Tavern Motor, and now
That's
it's
right.
Capitol Plaza. They had a room in back that was kind of a function room. And I felt really like exiled from Eden, you know, because I had to set up my own chairs, bring in a sheet to hang on the wall for the
that's right.
screen, you know. But that would lasted 2 years.
Yeah, yeah. I remember seeing a lot of films in there.
Yeah.
And you didn't let up. You didn't change your
Yeah, and I remember one, I had a surprising encounter there once. There's an old couple, now I say they're old. They were probably in their 60s then. Earl and Jean Curtis from Marshfield. And got to be, you know, chatting every week. Clearly they liked movies. And one day, there's nobody else online behind them, and Earl said to me, "Oh, you know, I should tell you sometime at the time that I was a driver when Hitchcock filmed Trouble with Harry up here in Craftsbury." What? So he was in charge of driving the art director for Trouble with Harry all over the Northeast Kingdom looking for props.
Wow.
For when they were shooting, at least half the movie got shot in Craftsbury.
Yeah, and they
So-
stayed in Stowe.
They stayed in Stowe, and
Yeah.
I hear Hitchcock loved to eat at the Country House in Barrie.
Yeah.
Insist on, you know, shut down at 5, get in the car, go to Barrie.
And Alma bought one of her favorite cookbooks, the Vermont cookbook, while they were in Stowe. So that was in one of the interview books. Patrick Leahy told the story of walking his dog when he was a kid and running into Hitchcock because they premiered it at the Paramount in
Yeah.
Barrie.
Yeah. There's a picture in the Old Times Argus of Hitchcock and Shirley MacLaine standing in front of the Paramount.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the Vermont crimes is Hitchcock painted his self-portrait on the wall in the lobby of the Paramount, and they painted over it later.
Oh,
You know,
no.
that like 5-line drawing that they used on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, that should have been preserved forever. But what was the leap, what prompted the leap, you talk about in your book, so people that read your book can get more in depth, but what prompted the leap from a film society to braving opening a full-time movie theater in Montpelier? That's a huge jump.
It's a huge jump, and
So I guess I'm looking for the catalyst more than the whole.
Well, the catalyst was, so there were two storefronts, 22, 26 Main Street, and 24 was apartments upstairs with a staircase going up. So 26 was a florist shop, and 22 was the art supply store, the drawing board, that my brother and his wife started.
Oh.
Art supplies is in my family because my parents were both art teachers. You saw the calligraphy that my father did.
I bought art supplies from your brother then.
Yeah, yeah. And
Cool.
my parents had both been art teachers in the New York City public schools. My father was blacklisted and was out of work and started an art supply store in this new thing that they called a shopping center in Yonkers in 1954. So John, my brother, we moved to Vermont, and John, walking around Montpelier, said, "There's no art supply store here. You have to go to Burlington to buy art supplies."
Capital Stationers was all there
Yeah.
was, so.
So he and his wife started the drawing board. And the landlord was an older guy named Ernest Masuko. The building had been in his family for a long time. In fact, the Savoy, as a silent movie spot, was called the Masuko Moving Picture Theater Company. And then that changed to the Savoy Theater in 1908. So we didn't know any of this history, that this very spot had been
Wow.
a movie theater. So anyway, my brother found out that Mr. Masuko was selling the building. And that was the catalyst, you know, that if he bought the building, then there was a storefront that could become
A theater.
a theater. A long, narrow theater, but
Yeah.
still a
yeah.
theater with 120 seats. So big leap. We took
Was
a
it
big leap.
liberating at first to not have to set up every week for a Friday night movie? I know the downsides, some of the downsides of running that kind of business, but was it also liberating to say, okay, there's a place finally?
Yeah, it was pretty exciting. I don't remember about the liberating part, but it was pretty exciting. And I remember my father saying, as we were, there were friends of my parents who were visiting, and my father's friend said to me, "So Rick, are you going to get rich from this venture?" And before I could think of a suitable comeback, my father said, "No, but I'm going to get poor."
There is no comeback after that.
Yeah. So I did have a lot of support from my parents to start with, and what we did was we had a substantial mailing list from the Film Society, and I wish I had some of these cards. You could pre-buy tickets to the theater, as a way of raising. It was like crowdfunding before anybody knew what that.
Yeah, set up
That
as like a
was.
sponsorship.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
So once again, it was, is this going to work? Is there the audience? And we couldn't really tell because everybody was very excited the first week when we showed Casablanca,
And then what?
but then hardly anybody came to see McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and then
Those upbeat Robert Altman movies really pack them in.
Aguirre, The Wrath of God, So the original idea behind the Savoy was continue the programming, little of this, little of that, little of that. But it became clear very quickly that people wanted to see the new movies. This is a real movie theater. It's on Main Street. I don't want to see a Film Society movie. I want to see a real movie. And there were two developments that we didn't know about that were happening that made that possible. The first is what's known as the Australian New Wave. We showed My Brilliant Career.
Judy Davis.
Huge hit. It was like, oh, this movie is beautiful to watch, it's accessible, they're speaking English, it has a real narrative, it's not a heavy foreign film. And it was, we could count on any time we played a movie from Australia, New Zealand, we could count on a crowd. And the other thing that happened was this was the beginning of the American indie movement. And the first indie we played, we opened in January, and in April was Return of the Secaucus 7.
John Sayles' first feature.
An enormous hit. And then, you know, Spike Lee and Jim Jarmusch, the Coen brothers. So I think as the audience for foreign films was dropping off, you know, that audience was now going to the American indie films.
And did that provide the Savoy a specialization? Because I was always curious. You had competition in the area when you opened. You still had the Capitol Theater downtown, which when I was growing up was one screen. I don't know when they transitioned
It was our first year. They went to
multiple
They went to
screens.
2, the next year to 4, and the year after that to 5.
And you had the competition from Barrie with the Paramount, and I was a drive-in junkie, so the Twin City Drive-In, I don't know when that closed down.
And not to mention competition from DVDs, video.
Well, that was in the 80s, right.
Which was 5 years after we opened.
Right.
And that was a real blow, you know, because why show an old classic when people can rent these movies at home, you know?
But I guess my question is, did films like Return of the Secaucus 7, the alternative distribution that was bringing in the Australian films, the Capitol wasn't going to touch those movies. The Paramount wasn't going to show those movies, and the drive-in sure wasn't going to show any of those movies.
Yeah, there was like, we couldn't get any movies from Columbia, Warner Brothers, Paramount, if we wanted, unless they were flops, unless they were written off by the studios and they were any takers for anybody. On the other hand, the independent distributors like Libra, Zeitgeist,
New Line when they were young.
Yeah. They couldn't break that wall of getting their movies into the Capitol or Paramount.
Right.
So we had a kind of a mutually, you know, a good thing going where, you know, we could call up New Line or First Run and say, you know, what's coming out? What should we be looking for? And they would often give us pretty good deals on it.
There were certain phenomena you didn't pursue. Like, I don't recall Rocky Horror Picture Show ever showing up. Those were conscious decisions, I take it?
Well, in the case of Rocky Horror Picture Show, our friends who ran a theater in Northampton and then our friends who ran a theater in Maine both said, whatever you take in at the box office, you will spend in cleaning up. It's not worth it.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
However, I was living in Wilmington, Vermont by the time you showed Polyester, the John Waters film, and I drove all the way to Montpelier. It was the only theater in Vermont showing Polyester.
Scratch and sniff.
Scratch and sniff cards. And I remember going with two of my dear friends who live in Middlesex, Bill and Sandra Cathy.
Oh, yeah.
And Bill came out and said, so is that what they think a mainstream movie is now?
We did not show Pink Flamingos, I must
But you
say.
did show Polyester.
We
So
did
you were
show
picking up,
Polyester.
and that was New Line, you know, before Lord of the Rings,
yeah.
and then we're going big time. But you were bringing in, you know, really adventurous fare.
Yeah, every once in a while it would give me kind of a perverse pleasure to go through our Rolodex every few years, just go through it and see how many of these small distributors had gone under and we were still there.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, there's like all these, you know, you could look at the graveyard of Vestron, Island Alive, and
Well, and the Savoy outlived Blockbuster. I mean, you outlived video as well. So, I I not to get lost in the weeds, but I'm also curious about how moving from Friday nights only, which is almost like you're facing the challenge of a drive-in cinema. If there's bad weather that Friday night, are people going to brave the drive out? There were dumb teenagers like me that would brave any weather to come to see it. But once you, I mean, were there times at the Savoy where having the regular show saved you from that danger of having a social retail business in Vermont that's so easily hindered by weather? Not counting floods. We won't talk about floods today.
Yeah, I didn't spend too much time thinking about that. I'm remembering a conversation I had with Fred Bashara, who owned the Capitol, and his brother-in-law owned the Moonlight Drive-In.
Oh, I remember the Moonlight. Yeah.
And he said that we would always be arguing, well, I hope it's going to rain tonight. No, I hope. There were just so many vagaries, and the one particular one that I remember, I think I included in the book a little haiku I wrote, inspired by looking out the Savoy window at the crabapple trees in front of City Hall. And the haiku went something like, crabapple blossoms in front of City Hall, empty seats at the Savoy.
Oh.
Because when spring came, we could count on May, April, May being really
Was
awful.
it the same in the fall when school started?
Yes, September and October were always.
I was a manager at a video store in Brattleboro. Same thing.
Yeah.
Video rentals died in spring once the weather got nice, and
Yeah.
died when school started.
And if there were movies that were, the movies that we wanted, that we had a feeling would be, oh no, we're saving that for Thanksgiving or Christmas.
Right.
And conversely, we're going to open that you can have that in July, but not in
Right.
April.
Right.
So you just have to roll with these punches that.
You have an entire chapter about your booker. And for those of you who don't know, the booker is the person who you would go to arrange which films you could bring into the theater. And you had quite a healthy relationship with a particular booker based in Boston, I would presume.
We had two bookers, but the one I wrote the chapter of, his name is Jeffrey Jacobs, and I always have to be careful I'm talking about him because there is a notorious landlord in Montpelier of
With
that
the same name?
With the same name.
Uh-oh.
I won't go into that. But Jeffrey had been involved in the Phantom, the Oddfellows.
Oh, in Waitsfield.
In Waitsfield. And we had mutual friends, and I would see him when he was in New York. He was booking the Angelica Theater in New York.
Wow.
And he was saying, okay, well, anytime, I'm now in this business, and anytime you get tired of dealing with these terrible people on the telephone, and I had good relationships with most of the people at the distribution companies, but there were a few who really gave me a hard time. And I just don't have the personality to...
It's a waste of energy to fight those kind of people.
To meet them on their level, let's say. So Jeffrey's line to me was, if you get tired of dealing with these people, I'll do it for you, let me be your asshole. So it was the way he put it. and that was his personality. He could, and his other line to us is, when people are nice to you, you've caught them on a good day. When people are nice to me, it's because they owe me something.
Oh.
So one of the first things Columbia Pictures wouldn't give us the time of day, but one of the first things he was able to do, he said, well, I got you River Runs Through It for 3 weeks at Christmas. And it turns out that Columbia didn't have any faith in this movie to do well.
Yeah, they didn't think it was going to do well, and it went through the roof.
Yeah, and it was just perfect for our audience. So Jeffrey, we loved to have Jeffrey throw his weight around on our behalf. And the Angelica was owned at that time by Harvey Weinstein.
Now infamous Harvey Weinstein, but
And-
yeah.
And so the cycle of the week is your movie opens on Friday. On Monday, you figure out whether you're going to play it another week.
Right.
So Monday is the day you consult with Jeffrey. This is available, this is not available. And there are a few Mondays I remember where Jeffrey would pick up the phone and he said, "Can I call you back later? I just got through with Harvey. I can't face talking to anybody else." And very, very abusive personality. But
He saved you from talking to him.
yeah, yeah. So that was a relationship that lasted from the late 80s until we sold the theater in 2010. And it's funny because the new owner of the Savoy, he and Jeffrey just did not get along. He went to somebody else. And
Oh, well, those kind of,
those relationships happen in any kind of business anywhere.
yeah, and they're not always transferable. The business
yeah.
doesn't carry. If folks have questions, I've got one question to ask before turning it over, which is, we've got local filmmakers here, who I recognize, and the Savoy went from occasionally bringing in local films and filmmakers, usually a special event, to your nurturing, being one of the folks that nurtured the Green Mountain Film Festival, which became a real, gravitational pull for not just regional Vermont and New England filmmakers, but all kinds of independent filmmakers
Yeah.
bringing stuff in. Any particularly memorable, events or films that you've shown working with local? Yeah, I'm sorry to tap your memory banks out
Yeah.
on the spur like that, but
No, I mean, we ran I was the programming director for the Green Mountain Film Festival for, I think 13 or 14 years. So every year there was some special event, guests, panels, filmmakers who would come in, and we just had great people. Les Blank, one of the great
Yeah.
documentary filmmakers, was there showing a few of his films. I tell a story in the book of, I don't know if the name Albert Maysles is familiar to anybody, one of the pioneers of
documentary
film.
filmmaking. Yeah.
And I was having lunch with a friend in Plainfield, and she was talking about the festival. She's like 10 years older. And she said, you ought to get Albert Maysles up here. He's an old friend of mine. Really? Albert Maysles coming to Vermont? He was already 82. And she said, "Oh yeah, I'll provide." It turns out they had, as a young couple, her first boyfriend, they had hitchhiked to Vermont together in 1948.
Oh, wow.
Or something,
Wow.
And so the connection was made. Albert said, "Yeah, I'll come up," and his assistant said, "Okay, so we need a few things. We need to have a minder. Not that he was a wild man like a rock star or anything, but he was 82. Somebody who could take him from the film to the hotel."
Yeah, tend to his needs and make sure, yeah.
He likes to have Gordon gin. Make sure
Oh.
we have that in his. I left him the choice of what movies we would show that he would talk about, and he picked his three best-known films: Salesman,
Right?
which followed a Bible salesman door to door. Incredibly, I mean, all his films are really discomforting in one way or the other.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Grey Gardens, probably the most discomforting film documentary ever made about the crazy mother and daughter on Long Island. And Gimme Shelter, where he filmed the Altamont Rolling Stones fiasco, and
And the shooting.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So, okay, we'll show those films. They'll get an audience. That would be great. We'll plan one for like noon. Then you can have a lunch break and go back to your, and then one at 4 and then one at 8. And we found a friend of mine who is just breaking into video production. He said, "Oh, I'll take him around."
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Well, it turns out he didn't need anybody. He was great, and I expected, okay, he's only seen Salesman 100 times. We're gonna start the movie. He'll go
He'll
back
leave,
to the motel. Then, no, he sat through all 3 of his movies. Did a Q&A afterwards.
Wow, amazing.
And gave our friend David, who was taking him around, just great advice. And so he lived another 3 years, made 2 more movies. And,
Amazing.
so that was quite memorable.
I had mentioned earlier no walkouts, I remembered, but I do remember there's something not in your book of you and I sat next to each other at one of the Green Mountain Film Festivals, and we laughed through one of the Canadian films from Winnipeg.
Guy Madden.
Guy Madden's, was it Cowards Bend the Knee?
Bend the Knee.
And half the audience left before we
Yes,
were done, and you and I were having a great time.
And we were watching walkout after walkout.
So,
Guy Madden grew up in Winnipeg, and his mother ran a beauty parlor, and he was really into ice hockey.
yeah.
So there's this incredibly melodramatic story shot in silent film fashion.
Yeah, he's fascinated by that period of film when it went from silent to sound, so he makes almost all his films as if they were made in 1928 with some sound technology, but you and I were just having a great time, and the audience was not having a good time.
So his protagonist was the star of the hockey team, and his girlfriend is pregnant. And it turns out that this hair salon in town doubles as an abortion clinic.
That's right.
After hours. It had something to offend everybody.
Questions?
Questions, please.
Anybody? You have Rick.
How many Jay Craven films
Quite a few.
have been through?
Definitely Where the Rivers Flow North, Disappearances. We showed High Water as a short, Stranger in the Kingdom. Yeah, we could, always count on those to have a good house, and Jay would always come. I got to get in a word for Jay's wife, Bess O'Brien. She is
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, because
really
you also brought in
just
Bess's films, H is for Heroin, and
yeah.
yeah.
And Bess's films made a better fit at our at the festival, where there were really topics we could have panels, and
Yep.
I have such incredible admiration for Bess. And Jay is still at it. He thought he was making his last film, but he turns out I think he's got one more in the
He's
works.
trying to retire. He's trying to retire.
Yeah, he's trying to retire. Yeah.
He says this is his last one.
Yeah. I got great admiration for Jay. I call him my comrade in arts instead of comrade in arms. At the same time, Lightning Ridge was going. He was starting his film society in St. Johnsbury, and sometimes we would, send films on to each other. And,
Right.
I must say, I don't have anything near Jay's knack for promotion. He's really good at it.
Yeah.
Indefatigable.
Yeah,
Is that the
yeah,
word?
and it takes being a showman, so, and Jay does have that knack. Other questions? Anybody?
Robert.
I used to get those little mailings from the Savoy showing which films did well and which did less well than expected. And I confess I could never figure that out.
Yeah.
I would never have picked those.
Yeah.
I wonder how good you were at
Yeah.
That's a
anticipating what would do
Yeah.
well or
Yeah.
poorly.
Well, this was in 1985 when we were facing a real crisis and actually closed for a month while we instituted a membership campaign. You know, you say you want us to be here,
support us.
support it, even if you can't come, even if you now have little kids and can't get out of the house, is it important for us to be here? And I thought it was a really good PR move to send out, when it came time for membership renewal, to do a chart saying, here are the 10 best attended movies of the year, here's the 10 least attended.
Oh,
And specifically going after, if you liked one of those least attended, you might be inclined to up your membership. Or say, oh, you mean people didn't go to that movie that I loved so much?
right,
Yeah.
right.
So it's funny, when we sold the theater in 2010, one of the first things the new owner did was, he didn't
Discontinue
like
that.
that idea.
Yeah.
He didn't like the idea of publicizing the fact that some movies didn't do well. What can you do? But I was so mad I could not find any of those old sheets. I wanted to put it in the book.
Yeah, that would have been a great appendix in the book. Yeah. Oh. Did you keep any? No. Probably. Ah, there you
Go
go.
looking with a shovel.
There you go. There you go. It's a terrific book. I hope anyone here who hasn't bought a copy will. I'll be your huckster if you'll let me. Really enjoyed it, and for me it was just an amazing, not just walk down memory lane, but really there aren't that many books that are snapshots of a community in Vermont that's also tied to independent business in Vermont, and you really have put together quite a document.
Well, you know, my wife Andrea was really instrumental in inspiring me to do this book. And one of the things she said very early on, she said, it's not just the story of the theater, it's the story of all of us in this community and Vermont in the 70s and,
Yeah,
you know, and I like to say to people, the Savoy did not happen by itself. It did not come out of nowhere. There was some very, very fertile ground.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
And Rick, thank you so much. And thanks to the bookstore.